As we step into the time of our message portion, we've been going through the book of Genesis for the past few weeks. Today, we're hearing the story shift from Jacob now to Jacob's son, Joseph. Now, Joseph's a pretty important character, and he has a really long story from Genesis chapters 37 to 50. We're going to hear a little bit of Joseph's story in our video for this morning.
Jacob settled in the land of Canaan, where his father Isaac and grandfather Abraham had settled. Jacob had 12 sons, but his son Joseph was his favorite. Jacob made Joseph a special robe, and all of Joseph's brothers were jealous and hated him. Then Joseph shared with his brothers some dreams he had. In these dreams, his brothers and father and mother bowed down to him. This made his brothers hate him even more. One day, the brothers decided to get rid of Joseph. They sold him to some men who took him away to Egypt, where he became a servant in the house of a man named Potiphar. Joseph served his master Potiphar well, and Potiphar placed him in charge of everything he owned. One day, Potiphar's wife lied about Joseph, accusing him of doing something he didn't do. Potiphar was angry, and he put Joseph in prison. While Joseph was in jail, he met a man who had been the cupbearer for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. This man told Joseph about a strange dream he had. God gave Joseph the ability to understand what the dream meant. This cupbearer would soon be freed from jail and serve the Pharaoh again. It happened just as Joseph had said. Then Pharaoh had some strange dreams. In one dream, 7 healthy cows were eaten by 7 thin, sickly cows. In another dream, 7 thin heads of grain swallowed 7 healthy heads of grain. The cupbearer told Pharaoh to send for Joseph. With God's help, Joseph told Pharaoh what the dreams meant. There would be 7 years of great farming in the land, followed by 7 years of famine, when no food would grow. Pharaoh was so impressed that he put Joseph in charge of everything in Egypt. When the famine came, Joseph's father and brothers had no food to eat. The brothers went to Egypt to ask for grain. When they first saw Joseph, they did not recognize him. Then Joseph told his brothers who he was, their brother they had sold into slavery. The brothers were afraid Joseph would be angry with them. But Joseph said, "You planned evil against me, but God planned it for good so that many would be saved." Even when bad things were happening in Joseph's life, God had a plan for good. Bad things also happened to Jesus. Jesus never sinned, but he was arrested, beaten, and killed on a cross. Those things happened to bring about our good, so people could be saved from sin and death through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection.
So I'm going to do a very short history lesson with you this morning. After World War I, there were nations that were pretty much ruined. There were cities that were in ruins. There was a lot of things that needed to be paid for. And so the nations come together and they say, okay, how are we going to pay for all of this stuff? And slowly, people started pointing their fingers at Germany. This is Germany's fault. Collectively, a lot of nations began to hold a grudge against Germany and make them pay for all of the damage. Germany was also in ruins. And just a couple decades later, what happens? World War II. Because that nation that was pushed down wanted to rise up. And the reason I'm sharing this very short history lesson is because I want you to see that holding a grudge does intense damage. You can see that from the story of World War I or World War II. You can see that in the story of our lives, that a lot of times the grudge does greater damage than what was happening in the first place. And that's what we see in the story of Joseph and his brothers too. Joseph, at the beginning of the story, they didn't talk that much about it, but Joseph was kind of a brat. He was really arrogant. He thought that he was better than all of his brothers, and he didn't just think that in his head. He told them, he made sure that they knew about it. One day, you guys are all going to bow down to me. That didn't really make his brothers happy. But they grew up with that. They were raised with that. Joseph continued to be that way. And what we see in Joseph's brothers is that they hold this grudge. And this grudge doesn't just stay inside of them. They bounce it off of each other so that this grudge kind of circles. They say, hey, that Joseph, that dreamer, what could we do to him to get back to him? And there's this scene before they sell him into slavery where his brothers are basically scheming against Joseph because the grudge has gotten so great that now they don't just want Joseph to fall down and be embarrassed. They want to get rid of him. That grudge did a lot of damage. They sold Joseph into slavery. What we heard in the story is that Joseph's story is kind of a roller coaster of highs and lows. The grudge did damage. And yet, when we see Joseph go away to Egypt, what ends up happening is he gets put in charge of all of Egypt, basically. He gets to be Pharaoh's right-hand man. What we see from this, from the bad things that Joseph's brothers do, we see God work it for good. And then there's this amazing scene where Joseph's brothers actually kind of bow down to him. They need him to help them. They need him to feed their families. And if Joseph were to hold a grudge against his brothers for what they did to him, well, the nation of Israel wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Jesus that Judah was. If Joseph had held a grudge, terrible things would have happened. But Joseph, he doesn't hold the grudge. And all of the damage that the grudge did to Joseph, that's healed when Joseph gives forgiveness. He accepts his brothers. He brings his brothers in. He says, I'll provide for you. I'll provide for your children. He actually convinces them to move with his father to Egypt so that he can be closer to them. Because the grudge does damage, but forgiveness brings healing. And that's not the entire end of the story. This is the more amazing part to me. After Joseph's father, Jacob, moves all the way to Egypt, they live probably for years with Joseph. And while they're living there, it seems like the brothers don't believe that they're forgiven. Because for the rest of Jacob's life, Joseph's father's life, they're holding on to this idea that maybe he hasn't forgiven me. And maybe you've been there before. You have this really quick interaction with a friend, and maybe the friend says something like, oh, I haven't seen you in such a long time. It's good to see you. Sorry, I got to go, right? And what that friend said to you is, I miss you. It was good to see you. I have somewhere to be. But what you heard as you dwelt on it was, well, they said it was a long time since they've seen me last. Have I been a bad friend? Maybe I'm really a terrible person in this relationship. Maybe this relationship is going down the tubes. Maybe what this person really was trying to say is that they don't want to be my friend anymore. That's kind of where Joseph's brothers were. What he said to them is, I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to make sure you're taken care of. And what they heard was, I'm going to wait until Dad dies, and then I'm really going to get back at you. Because they were cycling, assuming that Joseph had held a grudge. And when their father dies, they come to Joseph. And this is the first time they do this in the entire story. It's the very end of the book of Genesis. They say, Joseph, will you please forgive me? And I think that from this story, and Joseph, of course, Joseph forgives them. From this story, we really have two lessons to learn. The first is that the grudge does more damage than the first time we were hurt. And maybe today, maybe you're holding on to a grudge like Joseph's brothers were holding on to the grudge. And what that grudge does is just separates you more and more. And maybe that grudge comes out in the way you vent to the people around you. But the grudge is going to do more damage. Maybe what we need is forgiveness. And that second lesson we can learn is that if I assume that somebody's holding a grudge against me, maybe I need to ask forgiveness. And those two things kind of can seem like heroic acts. To put away the grudge and to ask for forgiveness, they seem like really big things. They can be really intimidating things, and in Joseph's story they were. But the truth of our story is that we don't live our stories by ourselves. We live our stories through the cross. We live our stories through the story of Jesus, who came to earth, who took all of the things that I've done wrong, all of the grudges I've held, all of the reasons I have had to hold a grudge. Jesus took those up to the cross, and even though he could have held a grudge, on the cross, while he's dying, Jesus looks down and says, "Father, forgive them." Jesus delivers forgiveness to you. He delivers forgiveness to everybody who has sinned against you. He is offering forgiveness constantly so that we can live in that forgiveness. Because grudges make divides, grudges separate, but forgiveness brings healing. Forgiveness brings us together. And God sent Jesus to bring forgiveness into your life. So let's live in that forgiveness. Amen.